So it's not often on a Sunday we talk about saints because we tend to focus on the gospel. But today in the calendar of the church is celebrations of saints. It's Saint Francis's feast day. So being a Franciscan, I got to talk about him. Now there's a little story about three Franciscan brothers who were traveling through Europe. They were pilgrimaging to Rome, and they finally arrived at the Basilica of St. Peter's. And along the way, they got these beautiful, luscious Italian olives. And they sat on the steps of St. Peter, and they figured they'll finish the olives before they go into the church. And so they're eating the olives, and they're spitting the pits out, and the juice is running down their beards. And one of the brothers remembers, we need something to drink. Let me go get some wine. So he goes off to beg a little Italian wine while the two of them are eating this olives and spitting the pits out, and eating the olives and spitting the pits out. And the other brother's coming back with the wine. He sees the Pope come out of the Vatican, looks at the two friars who are eating the olives and spitting the pits out, and they're like this. He goes back in the Vatican. So the brother comes running across the square and says, I can't believe this. I go and beg the wine, and you two get blessed by the Pope. They said, he didn't bless us. He said, yes, he did. I saw him bless you. He said, he didn't bless us. He says, yes, he did. He said, no. He said, you pick up the pits, take your friend and get out of here. Probably a true story, knowing friars. Saint Francis is oftentimes seen as the saint of animals or the saint of ecology or the saint of the garden. There's barely a Catholic with a bird bath that doesn't have a statue of Saint Francis holding it up, or a garden without a statue of Francis in it. And every statue of him seems to have him holding a bird or petting a rabbit or something like this. And there's some truth to those stories, but there's a whole other side of him that gets ignored. Although he grew up in the 13th century, the child of a very, very wealthy family, the wealthiest in the city, he had a lot of issues like everybody else did. He wasn't immune from the trials and difficulties of life. He grew up in what we would call a very dysfunctional family. His father had incredible conditional love. So long he was going to be a rich merchant like himself or go on to be a knight, he didn't really have much time for him. And so Francis sought his whole life to try to win his father's approval by seeking to be that rich merchant or being that great knight. He was so starving for love throughout his life that he did so much just to have friends and to be the life of the party and make himself the center of attention. And, he did very much just to try to be the party guy. He really became very obsessive about music. He loved song and dance and loved the songs of the Knights of the Round Table and the French troubadours and their love songs. And he also got pretty addicted to food. Nobody ever talks about that about St. Francis. He loved good tasting food. His father was Italian. His mother was French. You're going to like good tasting food in that combination. But he became very obsessed where he would only eat the finest foods. He became very self-absorbed, very selfish, self-centered in his life. And when his city went to battle against another city to prove himself to his father, to become this great knight that he was going to be able to finally win his father's approval and love, he went out in war against the other city. Most of his friends were killed in battle, and he was imprisoned for a year. And during that time in prison is when he began to wonder, what is life about? And ask those questions we all ask ourselves of, why am I alive? Why do I exist? Why am I here? Is there any purpose and meaning to my life? What if I were to die as my friends did? Where would I be? What comes next? Who is this God? This time in prison was really a time to wake up and really think about those questions. We all have to ask ourselves about who we are, the truth of who we are and why we are. When he was finally released from prison, he was very sick and he kind of wandered about, but although he was asking the questions, he was not looking truly for the deeper answers. Finding no answers, in the world, he kind of fell back into the same behavior of the whole party, prince of rebels type thing. Oh, his friends loved to go to his house because he had all the money, so he had all the food and all the parties. So he was the party guy. And then the time came where he was about to go to war again, to try again to win his father's approval, to get that unconditional, get that love from his father. And he saw a dream of these shields with crosses, and he saw these swords, and he figured, I'll go to the Crusades. And on his way to the Crusades, the Lord said to him, Francis, who is it better to serve, the master or the servant, God or the world? He said, well, the master, of course. Then why are you serving the servant? He returned home, and that's when his life began to seek the answers that of those questions in prayer before God, and asked God himself, the only one who had the answers, to ask the questions, why do I exist? Who am I? Who are you, God? And as he began to discover the incredible giftedness of God, he began to see himself, his sinfulness, his selfishness, his self-centeredness, and he began to realize just how interior he had become, how much turned in on himself he had become. And he began to realize more and more the love of God, but he became filled with guilt and shame over his sinfulness, over how he made himself the center of his world and everybody else's world. And it was time to change. He realized he was created for something more beautiful, that he was made in the image and likeness of God, created for the glory of the kingdom of heaven. And he realized it was time to give his life over to God. But in the midst of this time, he became very heavy as he thought about his sinfulness, his selfishness, and how much he betrayed God in his life. And one moment in prayer, he was up on this cave in the hill next to his city, and he was weeping over his sins, feeling very heavy about it. And suddenly Christ appeared to him hanging upon the cross. And as he's thinking about his sinfulness and how the Lord bore his sins, and by his sins, how he participated in the passion of Christ, in the sufferings of Christ, he started feeling the heaviness of the guilt and of the shame. But all of a sudden, his sinfulness, his guilt, his shame was smacking against the mercy and the love of God. And as much he tried to put forward that he wasn't worthy of being loved, wasn't capable of being loved, that he had been so sinful that God should not love him, he was experiencing this intense, incredible, powerful mercy and love of God. And it made him cry out a prayer that he would pray for the rest of his life. Who are you? And what am I? Who are you, God? And what am I? What am I but a poor, miserable wretch of a sinner? Who are you that you love me so much? Who are you? You see, Francis had become overwhelmed by that love of God. He began to realize, yes, he was this horrible sinner, but God had unconditional love for him. That no matter how sinful he had been, he could not turn away the love of God from him. He could not push away the mercy of God. He did not find himself worthy of God's love or worthy of God's mercy. And God looked at him and said, no, you are loved. And it was that experience of the unconditional love of God. For the first time in his life, he experienced unconditional love. And it was that love of God that changed him, that love of the cross that transformed his life and freed him. St. Paul says in this first reading, have no anxiety at all, but in everything by prayer, petition, with thanksgiving, make your requests known to God. But that having no anxiety, Francis was freed of all anxiety, all fear, because he became convicted of the truth that God loved him. And that's what freed him to live the life that he lived, to truly believe the words of the gospel. That he had not to worry about what he was to eat, or what he was to drink, or what he was to wear, because the Heavenly Father knew his needs. He believed those words, and he lived relying on those words, and so that's where his joy came from. He knew for a fact that Jesus' words were true, that the Father loved him, even as he loved Jesus Christ, as Jesus says in chapter 17. And so he's able to rest upon that. He counted on the fact that every hair on his head was counted by God the Father. He believed in the truth that not one sparrow falls to the ground without the Father knowing it, and each person is worth more than a whole flock of sparrows. And he believed in those words, and those words freed him from the anxieties and the fears of the world. His whole life from that moment in the cave was one long desire to love God as God had loved him. To love the Lord his God with his whole heart, his whole soul, his soul mind. And that love of God, that desire to love God, led him to love the poor, to love the needy, to love the weak, to love the leper, to love those that no one thought worthy of being loved, especially the most sinful. There was one day when he was just after that experience at the cross, before he began his whole life, there was this leper hospital near where he grew up, and there was a leper going down the street. He saw the leper, and usually when he was younger, he'd run away from the lepers, and he saw this leper, and he thought, if God can love me with all of my sinfulness, who am I not to love this man? And he embraced the leper and kissed him on his open sores. And then he actually went down to the leper hospital and apologized to all the lepers for the way he used to treat them. And then he began to serve them as if he was their mother, caring so tenderly for each of them with such kindness, because he knew God's love, and so he had to express that love to others. He knew it just wasn't a matter of being loved, but now that he had to not only love God, but he had to love others, especially the most rejected, the most wounded, the most abandoned, and to serve them not as one above them, but like Christ, to serve them as one below, just as Christ washed the feet of the apostles, doing something only a slave would do. Saint Francis knew that he had to serve from the lowest place. In his short 20 years as a religious, dying at the age of 45, very young. I used to think 45 was old until I passed 45. Now at 53, 45 is young. He died a young man. But 2 years before his death, once again he beheld Christ hanging upon the cross. And desiring to love God as he had been loved, his body became transfixed with the stigmata in his hands, his feet, and his side. He bore the wounds of Christ. For 2 years of his life, those last 2 years, he became a living crucifix, the first to bear the stigmata. Became a living crucifix, proclaiming to the world in his own body the love of Christ Jesus. Today, as we reflect upon the life of Saint Francis and we look at these words of Saint Paul to the Philippians, have no anxiety. That's easy for you to say, Paul. But look at those words, have no anxiety. Why can Saint Paul say that? Because Saint Paul came to believe in the love that God had for him. Like Saint Francis, it's important for us to take all that we are, all of our miserableness, all of our brokenness, all of our woundedness, and to stand before God with all of that and know that we are loved unconditionally by him, that his mercy, his love, his goodness is far greater and far more than any of our brokenness and any of our sinfulness. That no matter how weak we have been, how broken we have been, we can never push God away. But his love triumphs over our sinfulness, our brokenness, when we let him. His love will triumph. And when we are convicted of the truth of that love, and truly, really believe it in the depths of our hearts, allowing that love to dispel all the fears and tell the fears and the anxieties and the worries and all the other stuff to go away. You're not welcome anymore. And pushing all that aside, give room and place to the love of God that frees us to rest in the Lord, thanking him for all things, especially for his unconditional love. So today, as we think about Saint Francis, let's not think about the patron saint of the bird bath or the guy running around petting animals. You know, the animals used to go to him, just so you know that. He had become so close to God that they lost all fear of him. That's where the animal stories come from. They lost all fear of him because he becomes so close to Christ. But the biggest lesson today, I think, from Francis, the biggest lesson of his life, is a man who became so convicted by the love of God that nothing stopped him from loving as he was loved. Let's ask the Lord for that grace today, to so convict us of his love that we ourselves will hold back nothing of ourselves or for ourselves, that we should love the Lord our God completely, totally, in the way that we have been completely and totally loved. May God bless you. May Mary keep you.